Earlier today, Atlas USA announced that the Shin Megami Tensei 1 iOS port would be receiving a localization. Now, notice that I said localization and port. This is not a new product. This is not being made as we speak. The base game is already complete. It came out in Japan 2 years ago on the Google Play Store and on the App Store. Keep this in mind as you watch the rest of the video. Many people seem to be under the impression that this is a game that is being made as we speak in Japan and then receiving a localization or something to that effect. This is just a localization project. Atlas of Japan currently has nothing to do with it aside from having made the game and releasing it 2 years ago. This is all being done by Atlas USA. With mobile gaming being a very hot topic in the gaming world recently, naturally a lot of negative reaction was had to the trailer. In fact, here's a bunch of comments that were left on the trailer's YouTube comment section. A lot of people questioned, why iOS? Why not the eShop? Why not PSN? That's where all your fans are. A lot of people were saying that they had felt betrayed because it was being released only on iOS. Now, as much as I don't really care for iOS gaming as a whole, there is a reason for this, and not many people are seeing it, so that's why I've created this video, to help explain to the people that don't seem to understand how game development works, especially on a lower scale level such as Atlas. This is pretty much going to explain why an iOS release is honestly the only realistic choice and why it's a necessary evil. Let me start by saying I fucking love Shin Megami Tensei 1. It was my first ever Megami Tensei game as a whole. I am so happy that I played through the majority of the game blind and that I didn't need a guide until later on when the game got kind of bullshit. It was such an amazing experience for me, and it really is honestly what got me into the Megami Tensei series, and I'm a huge fan of that now. If you keep up with me on YouTube, you know I make videos of the series all the time. In fact, I have a podcast about the series. So, I know a lot of you are probably thinking, wow, this guy is a huge Shin Megami Tensei fan. He's probably pretty biased towards Atlas. That's not necessarily true. I've definitely called out Shin Megami Tensei's lesser points in a lot of my videos, especially the podcast. In fact, I've even said negative things about what I've played of the iOS ports of Shin Megami Tensei 1, 2, and if, to be completely honest, I badmouthed them in the very first episode of my podcast towards the end. Hell, I'll play an audio clip right now. All of the Super Nintendo mainline SMT games were re-released on the iPhone, and they're $14 each. You can buy them with any iPhone since the App Store is not region locked. The only problem being that they're $14 each, and the interface is cluttered, so it's so hard to play. And I'm not saying that because I don't understand Japanese, because I've played SMT1 before. I know what I'm doing. It's just hard to like maneuver. It's not fun to play at all, and they're $14, and I don't think they've ever gone on sale. I've called Atlas out on bullshit before, but I really don't see this localization on iOS as bullshit. I really don't. Now, let me start this by saying Shin Megami Tensei 1, as much as I love it, is definitely not a game for everyone. Hell, it's a game that a lot of Megami Tensei fans can't get into. It's old, it's dated, even compared to games like Soul Hackers or Persona 1, Persona 2, which honestly, here, I'm going to pull up some review excerpts right now. They were criticized by many reviewers because they were old and dated and weren't necessarily the most fun to get through. Shin Megami Tensei 1 is older and more dated. It's really hard for even Megami Tensei fans, like I said before, to go back and play the game unless they forgive its poor gameplay. I'm just going to throw that out there. Hell, there's points in the game where they don't even tell you where to go next to advance the plot. There's a lot of gameplay mechanics that flat out aren't explained to you. There is a boss that is unwinnable unless you go find a random ass item that you need to go through like 2 or 3 traps to even get, so you probably think you're going the wrong way at that point. And also, there are points in dungeons where there's just fog, and every step you take, you need to open up your map just so you can make sure you're going the right way. It is not very fun to go back through. I'm sorry, but it's not. It is very, very old. Does that mean the game is bad? Fuck no. Like I said before, I love it. It's one of my most favorite games of all time. But it's not for everyone. You need to be the type of person that can forgive the game for being a relic, if that makes sense. It was a game that was definitely very innovative for the time, but time has not been nice to it. And unfortunately, not many people have the patience to go back through and keep that in the back of their mind when they're playing Shin Megami Tensei 1. If critics thought that Soul Hackers Persona 1, Persona 2 had issues with being dated, then they are definitely in for a treat when they get their hands on Shin Megami Tensei 1. So I'm going to be right up front and say this. Shin Megami Tensei 1 is not going to be reviewed highly. Not many critics are going to like this, and the ones that do are going to be people that are probably already Megami Tensei fans or people that really like old RPGs. It's a game that won't appeal to everyone, especially people that have honestly been brought up in modern gaming. Critics as a whole probably are going to be biased more towards more recent entries in gaming history, and as a result, Shin Megami Tensei 1 definitely is not going to receive high scores. And reviews don't necessarily mean anything, so I'm just going to say this too. The general gaming audience is not going to appreciate Shin Megami Tensei 1. It is almost a niche within a niche. Megami Tensei fans have a hard time getting back into this game. This is for the hardcore Megami Tensei fans that really want to see where the series started, that really want to see the introduction of the gameplay mechanics and story elements. This is something that is going to not have good word of mouth for general people. You're going to get a lot of people that don't even know what the fuck Shin Megami Tensei is. They'll download it for whatever reason, and then they'll play maybe 5 minutes before deciding the game is shit. It's going to be one of those games. It is definitely a game that the general gaming public is not going to appreciate, and because of that, this probably will not sell well, which is my third point. Shin Megami Tensei 1 in its current state will absolutely not generate a large profit for Atlus USA. I'm sorry, but no matter what marketing or what techniques you do to sell your game, if the game is old or dated or if it's not fun to play, it will not make money. And I'm sorry, but Shin Megami Tensei 1, without forgiving on part of the player, isn't fun to play. It just isn't. So now I want to go through and talk about a few suggestions people have made. So first, I said in its current state. So a lot of people are going to be quick to say, why not remake or improve Shin Megami Tensei 1 some way, shape, or form? Well, like I said at the start of this video, only Atlus USA is involved with this project. Atlus USA does not develop games. This would require Atlus of Japan to do so first. They would need to be the ones to first make a Shin Megami Tensei 1 remake or improved version of some sort. And Atlus of Japan currently has their hands full. They're not necessarily the biggest organization. They're already working on games like PQ, Persona 4 Arena Suplex Hold, Devil Survivor 2 Break Record, Persona 4 Dancing All Night, Persona 5, and Shin Megami Tensei Cross Fire Emblem, hopefully. It would be a while before Shin Megami Tensei 1, whatever, or hell, anything else, would even be thrown in there for their development teams to work on. It would probably be a couple years. And honestly, while this does remove the factor of it not being fun if they do the remake right, it's definitely going to be more expensive than just porting or localizing the game in some way, shape, or form. So let me get the next question out of the way. Why not create a new port of Shin Megami Tensei 1 for PSN and or the eShop? Well, once again, I'll say that this requires Atlus of Japan. Atlus USA does not make their own games. They only localize and translate games. Also, people fail to realize that a good port, one that actually functions and is not glitched to hell and back, requires a decent budget to make sure the game behaves properly on new hardware. You can't just copy and paste the game data and call it a day. Spending money on a game that will more than likely make a mediocre profit is risky anyways, if not outright stupid. You're going to be spending a large sum of money making sure that this game works. I mean, hell, even Soul Hackers was a fairly good port, and it had a decent budget. There were still glitches and freezing issues that people were having with it. Making a decent port costs money, and Shin Megami Tensei 1, I'm sorry to say, probably isn't going to pull a big enough profit to be worth the risk. So this leaves Atlus USA with one option: localize a version of the game that has already been released in Japan. So a few of you might be saying, but what about on the Virtual Console, or releasing it as a PS1 classic, just releasing an older version and then translating it? Well, there's a few problems with that. The main thing is that these re-releases are virtually untouched when released. Case in point, look at the PS1 Classic store. On the import section, they have the Mega Man games. All the menus are untranslated. Generally, they are put up as is with little to no tampering of any kind. In fact, Sony and Nintendo very rarely allow editing of software re-released under these online services anyways, let alone a full localization. That is massively changing the software, and we've never seen Sony or Nintendo approve of such action beforehand, so I'd be very surprised to see them do it for Shin Megami Tensei. Not to mention, you have a lot of issues similar to the port scenario. In this scenario, you need a decent budget to make sure that the translation doesn't negatively affect the game's performance at all. Honestly, the fact that Atlus would be relying on emulation software created by a separate company also has its fair share of issues. I mean, even Atlus has run into this issue before. Ghostlight, who has worked with Atlus a lot for releasing European titles, tried to get Digital Devil Saga on the European PSN store, but they couldn't because Sony's emulation software that they use for PS2 games couldn't handle Digital Devil Saga. And they ran into a situation where they couldn't quite figure out how to mess with the emulator to get it working. And it came down to a situation where Sony would have to just completely rework the emulator or upgrade it to get Digital Devil Saga on. And of course, Sony isn't going to bend over just for one game company, so it just never came out. There's a lot of issues. Not to mention, you're basically putting yourself inside of a framework created by another company that you don't necessarily know the ins and outs of. It's a risky situation, and development will be a nightmare. Like I said before, Atlus USA basically needs to take a version of the game that's already been released in Japan and localize it. Now, here's a list of all currently released versions of Shin Megami Tensei 1 in Japan. Notice anything? Well, if you haven't noticed, basically the only version of the game that is on a platform that's still alive in any way, shape, or form in the West is for iOS and Android. For some reason, there is no Android version announced yet. Maybe they're testing the waters with iOS, or maybe they think for now that iOS is risky enough as is, but I hope in the future they come up with an Android version. I don't see why they wouldn't, but that's not what this video is about. So, honestly, once you look at it that way, iOS or Android is really the only choice they have if they want to bring Shin Megami Tensei 1 over at all. There's a few benefits to this that should be pointed out. Mobile development is cheaper than ever, especially compared to PSN or the eShop. Hell, there's a reason you see a lot more indie games and, well, I guess budget games as a whole being made on the iOS or just mobile devices in general. The maintenance costs aren't as much because, yes, once you upload a game to an online service to buy, you do have to continually pay to keep it up there, or else it gets delisted. And it's a lot more expensive to have your game put on and kept on PSN or the eShop or Xbox Live or whatever you want it to be on. As a result, the mobile scene is perfect for a financially risky project such as a Shin Megami Tensei 1 localization. As I said previously, this is the only realistic option for Atlus USA releasing Shin Megami Tensei 1 out west without Atlus of Japan having to do something first. And most importantly, the idea that Shin Megami Tensei 1 would ever have a chance of localization in the first place is downright incredible. It is a product that will only appeal to a small amount of people within a relatively small fan base in terms of video game fan bases. Like I said before, Megami Tensei, small fan base, especially compared to something like Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest. And like I said before, Shin Megami Tensei 1 is not a game for all Megami Tensei fans. Basically, what this game comes down to is this localization project is a love letter to a very small amount of dedicated Megami Tensei fans, me included, people that want to experience the start of the series, even though they know it's not necessarily the greatest product or game ever made, and they know it's not the most enjoyable experience. Honestly, Atlus is risking a lot on putting out a project that will appeal to a very, very small amount of their fans. And so if the only way that an official localization of Shin Megami Tensei 1 can be released in its current state is on iOS devices, possibly Android in the future, then I'm fine with that. Like it or not, video games are a business. Money is involved here. No company is going to release something that is going to lose them a shit ton of money. So if this is the only way that Shin Megami Tensei 1 is going to be localized, so be it. In fact, you could probably think of it like Bayonetta 2. Either we get it in a form we don't necessarily like, or we don't get it at all. So if you listening to this right now see anyone wondering why this isn't getting a 3DS or Vita or PS3 or whatever release, feel free to link to them this video for an explanation. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you're as hyped for Shin Megami Tensei 1 for iOS as I am.